Hello YouTube. Hello YouTube indeed, and welcome to this week's video. Today we're going to be tackling the pestilent apostles of Mortarion himself, the Death Guard, and not in the standard green scheme but by popular demand in the lesser seen white/bone scheme. Let's head to Downcam and start taking a look at that. Okay, let's get into it. We're going to be starting with just a spray primed miniature in an ivory colour. I've used Graveyard Bone from Reaper MSP because that's what I wanted to use later on, and I do recommend a colour that you have access to as a bottle paint. We're going to start off, alarmingly, with some oil paints, Ivory Black and Burnt Umber. Don't be scared, these are cheap and readily available from Amazon. We're also going to need some White Spirit, which you can see me just mixing some of these oil paints into now. And I'm essentially looking for a kind of inky washy consistency. Oil, when used to make washes with White Spirit though, it does behave very differently to acrylic washes. The surface tension is a lot lower, so it flows into the recesses much deeper and just stains the surfaces lightly. You can also do some other tricks with it, which you're going to see shortly. So we're now going to start lathering that oil wash over every surface of this miniature, and we really want to be thorough here. We want to make sure that there's no pure ivory left. We are going to come back in shortly and bring some of that brightness back to the piece, but we want to start out with a very thorough, well-covered miniature, and that's just important for making sure that all of our deepest shadows are established, because this wash here that's its function. It's going to primarily bring in our lowest points of shadow and blend those out for us. You can see now how that looks when it's thoroughly covered. It's going to want a good chunk of drying time now, a good hour, or use a hairdryer. Next up, once that is all dry, you can see it's turned matte, and we can just use some White Spirit on the end of our brush now. I'm using an old brush here. It is a sable, but it's an old one that I wouldn't really use for anything else. And just with a bit of White Spirit on the end, we can just start to paint away any of that oil wash that we don't want present anymore. And what this is going to do is it kind of seamlessly transitions as you paint it away, and you end up with blends going back into your recesses kind of for free. You don't really need to do anything, they just happen by themselves, which is super useful. Just because it saves a little time, it takes a step out where you're having to, think about those blends into your shadows yourself and put them in. So we're just going all around the miniature now. Anywhere that we want that ivory nice and bright again, we're moving all of that oil wash away using our White Spirit. Really, really simple and straightforward. You can see that I am hitting every surface, even the bits that are going to be coloured differently, just for the sake of completion. There you are, now that he's cleaned up, you can see he's looking much brighter. We're going to go into that same colour we primed with now, Graveyard Bone. And this is just to start adding some extra brightness to some of the surfaces. So we're not looking to completely cover surfaces here, we still want to leave some transitions in heading towards those shadows. But we do want to brighten up some of the flatter parts, some of the parts that would have a lot of light on them, that kind of thing. So we just come back into our Graveyard Bone here and start to apply that. It's quite a thin layer. It's certainly not a glaze, but it is quite a thin layer. And that's just going to help it blend back into the stained colour underneath. And obviously, as I said before, we have been very, very careful to make sure that those oils are completely dry before we try to paint acrylic over them. Areas like the shoulder pads there and the top of the helmet are very, very important to get nice and bright. So those are really the primary places that I wanted to target. But also, as I say, those big flat panels as well, because it is power armor. Even though it's Nurgly power armor with damage all over it, it does still have quite a few open spaces. You do want to keep them looking fairly bright. nice few areas to infill now. Make sure we hit things like those fingers. Really makes a model pop when you remember to just tag some highlight onto things like fingers, backs of hands, that kind of thing. As you can see, with that quick whip round, we're now looking a hell of a lot brighter, ready to start moving on to some other parts. Alright, we're going to start getting back into some metallics now on the piece, and I just wanted to take a second to remind you of a couple of things before we commence with that. So the first thing that's really important is, I cannot stress this enough, make sure that everything you've been doing with oils at this stage is dry. It matters so much. Your paints are going to clump up if they come into contact with any of that oil or white spirit, and it's particularly bad with metallics, so just be double sure. Whack a hairdryer over it if you're not sure, or give it an hour just to really make sure that those oils are dry. The other thing, just talking about metallics briefly, is to remember not to use them on your wet palette. Metallics, the particles in them do disperse a lot quicker if you use them on a wet palette, and it can be very difficult to get good coverage out of them. So just a little reminder as well to make sure that you're using your dry palette or your well palette for any kind of metallic painting. Right, let's crack on. So next up is some Decayed metal from scale 75. Any kind of dark copper is going to do the job for you here, but I really like the way Decayed metal covers. It's a very easy paint to get on, and it is kind of unique. There's not a lot out there that looks like it. We're just going to start hitting all of the trim now with this Decayed metal. You can see it's really nice because it's a good shiny dark copper, but it sort of self-highlights in kind of almost a silvery reflectiveness. It's very interesting the way it reflects light. And this allows you to do some cool tricks, which we'll explore a little bit later as we highlight it. But for now, we're just going to whip round and get this copper onto all of the metal parts in the miniature. This was actually probably the most tedious stage of the entire workup. So, you know, be forewarned of that in advance. This is probably the bit that's going to slow you down the most over the course of this entire miniature. There's a lot of just little bits of trim and little accessories, and some of them are in hard to reach areas, so you do have to really just slow down for a second and be careful. But you're going to see also, as soon as you've got this copper on, you really start to see some contrast appearing in the miniature. You start to get a great idea of what it's going to look like as a completed piece. That helps a hell of a lot. Getting into this little trim on his shoulder pad here, this was one of the really tricky areas. Hitting the underside of it nicely without accidentally grazing the shoulder, and it's very important at this stage to try your very best to be neat, because it's hard to correct over this metallic. It can be done, but it's very tricky. Go with those metallics in place, you can see, as I said, a lot of contrast starts to appear. That really helps the overall look of the piece. Just using some solid black now from Reaper, and we're going to start dropping in all of the areas that either need to be black or are going to later be metallic. Again, this is another area where you do want to be careful. A bit easier to correct here, because if you go outside of the lines on this black, you're probably going to hit metal, and that decayed metal from scale covers over black really nicely. But you do still want to be a little bit careful. You know, every second that you save by not making a mistake is a second less that you have to spend correcting. And sometimes correcting can be slower than you know, the initial painting, so it really does you well to try your best to practice being neat. I am using the footage at a very, very high speed here, just because, you know, I assume that you're aware of how to just paint things flat black. And I did figure this could be a bit of a boring part of the video if we went too slow on it. So I'm just whipping through this as quickly as possible for you. With those blacks in place, now you can see how we're looking. One last quick little correction there. We're looking pretty sharp. Again, adding another stage of contrast. Into some Thrash metal from scale 75 now, one of my absolute favourite metallic paints. Really reminds me of Chainmail from Games Workshop in the 90s. Not sure if anyone watching will remember that, but it was a beautiful paint. We'll just start to hit all of the areas that we want a kind of silver metallic on. There's going to be other effects going over the silver, which is the reason I start with quite a bright silver. You might be tempted when painting a Death Guard piece to start with a really dark silver, but that doesn't give you a lot of room to go down with shades and washes. So you do really, for this workup at least, you want to start with quite a bright silver. You'd probably use something like, if it was GW's paint, I think it's called Silver? Is that the one? He says tentatively, not really knowing GW's paint range very well. Runefang Steel. Yes, that's what it's called, isn't it? Runefang Steel. There we go. Silvers in again as another layer is added, we start to get closer and closer to seeing what our finished piece will look like. Now it's time to start dulling down those metallics, starting off with dark tone from Army Painter's Quickshade. This is where we start to add all of our kind of weathered metallic effect, and we're going to hit all the metallics with this. I sometimes thin this a little with some Painter's Milk from the Painter's Bakery. But I don't tend to thin it a lot. If I'm using dark tone, it's usually because I want to bring that metal down quite a bit. If I only want to bring it down a little, I tend to use strong tone. So whilst you will see that I've clearly thinned it, it's not super thin. I've not brought it right down to, you know, being really, really wishy-washy, because I just wanted to darken that metal quite significantly. See, we're just nipping around everything that's metal. Then back in with the original colour and just add some highlights. Because we've darkened it down so much, we don't need to use an actual highlight colour here to highlight. We can just go back into our first colour. And I keep my metallics fairly thin when I first start passing in with them. So what you'll tend to see is when I first come in, I'm using reasonably thin metallics so that I can kind of apply a layer with a little bit of transparency to it, see how I feel about where it's sitting, and then I can come back with some thicker, brighter metallic on top of that if I'm sure that, you know, I'm happy with how the highlight is placed. Old copper from scale 75 now to highlight our coppery areas. And again, we're just looking for kind of raises and edges and stuff like that. This is one of the cool little tricks that I was saying with that decayed metal. Because it reflects with a slight silver tone, when you highlight it with copper, you get these sort of blended highlights where you get little bits of cold tone reflection next to little bits of warm tone reflection. And it creates a really cool look. It's a bit hard to define, but it's just interesting to look at. Sometimes I think interesting to look at is exactly what you want in a miniature. So we're just picking out highlights in all the usual areas that you'd expect to find them. And same again, keeping the metal pretty thin initially, and then thickening it up as we get more sure of what we're doing. So with some metallics applied, that's what we've got. Starting to look good. Cheeky little trick coming up next. We're going to go into some Aethermatic blue contrast paint. We're going to thin this a lot, and unfortunately, because Mr. Shy is an idiot, I actually lost my footage of me placing this in. But it's just a directional glaze heading in towards our shadows. So we've just taken the Aethermatic blue and pushed it in the direction of our shadows, just to build up some gentle cold tones. This isn't really an effect as such as it's just filtering a bit of colour to introduce some coldness. There's a lot of warm. Now to continue with that theme, we're going to grab Grindyglow blue from Reaper MSP. That's a mouthful. We're going to thin this right down to a wash consistency, and we're going to use this for our copper verdigris. I prefer this to a Nihilakh oxide, A, because again it's matte, as all Reaper paints are, and it's a bit more matte than Nihilakh oxide. But also it leans just a little bit more in the direction of blue than green. Verdigris, despite being called verdigris, which you know, obviously implies green, it has a bit more blue to it than Nihilakh oxide. That colour doesn't quite work for me. What you're going to want to do with this essentially is place it in like you were placing a wash, so you're heading for shadow points, but you want to head onto like the bottom halves of things and areas where water will be able to pool and therefore form oxide. However, what you want to do here is build this up in a couple of layers like you would a highlight, shrinking the application each time you build up another layer. So it's sort of a cross between a shade and a highlight in how you need to view the application. I'm going to get into some rust effects next time with Sunrise Orange, a nice matte pale orange. It looks a lot more vibrant in the bottle than it actually goes on, but this is just my first layer of rust, and this is also my largest layer of rust. Same sort of things with the copper oxide. We're just looking for recesses and areas where water would pool and turn into rust. The idea with Death Guard being that they kind of rust and decay immediately. Now for a mid-tone, we've got some Mars Orange from Scale 75. And again, just shrink that rust down, increasing in vibrancy, decreasing in surface area. That's kind of the shorthand to remember. Going all around the miniature. And then once we're happy with the mid-tone, we then go into the deepest parts of the rust. We're going to use this Holly Berry from Reaper MSP. And again, this is going to be the smallest application now. We're really just looking for those deep recesses. This is just going to help that rust pop. It's going to give it a bit of vibrancy, draw the eye to it. Also just grabbed a bit of silver there just to re-scuff some of the surfaces, and then went back in with my deeper rust colour and just dotted some sort of splashy rust around the piece. Those are just a couple of quick little next level things that you can do. If you rust an entire surface, you can sort of graze back the edges of it with some of the metallic underneath. And when you apply rust, I think it can be nice to just have some little splashy bits of it around as well. It just looks cool. Okay, now we've gone back into our oil wash just to sort of re-establish some kind of dripping, running areas of decay and gunk and filth. And this is not, you're not looking for a final finished application in this step. you're looking for a sort of guideline. You're laying in areas where you want these sort of drips and runs and pools to live. You're not really looking to be super accurate at this stage. You can see we've got some pretty chunky kind of drip lines and stuff like that. What we're now going to do is actually refine those. So back into White Spirit. And as we use that White Spirit to just do a bit of cleaning, we can sort of make those lines a bit skinnier, control the direction of them a little, that kind of thing. It's important to do this at this stage because you always want the oil work to sit underneath the acrylic work. The oil work wants to be a sort of ground work, and the acrylic work is where you have your poppy sort of vibrant, assertive painting. Now we're just going to start highlighting some black. You've seen me highlight black before. I just, for mid-tone neutral black like this, I'm just going to be mixing my Graveyard Bone, which is the ivory that was on my palette, with my black, and just building up highlights, adding more and more ivory, shrinking those highlights, a standard layer highlight, the kind of thing that you've seen on a million miniatures before. Shrinking those highlights down, moving closer and closer to raised edges and catch points for light as we get lighter each step. Starting to look good. This next stage is a fun part now. We're going to grab 2 paints from Reaper MSP, Thuvian Sun Orchid, which is a bubblegum pink, and Royal Purple, which is actually a bit more vibrant than it looks in the bottle. We're going to start to apply these to all of the sort of fleshy covered pipe areas. There's also a few areas where the armour starts to kind of meld and transform into the fleshy pipey stuff. When we get to those areas, we'll just use the Royal Purple as a glaze, and again just use that directional glazing, pushing the purple from the surface of the armour in towards those pipes so that the blend gets more intense as it gets closer to the pipe. And then when it reaches the pipe, it's already at the pure Royal Purple colour, so we've got that reference point to blend into. I struggled to capture footage that showed that really, really well, so you are going to have to look out for it. But it is essentially just the colour that I'm already painting with, but just thinned down a lot more. What we then start to do with this Royal Purple is progressively add in Thuvian Sun Orchid to it and start to lay in these quite broad highlights. Now, these aren't going to be the final highlights. We will start to add Graveyard Bone into that to get the final highlights, to get the more sort of poppy highlights. But for establishing a sort of blend going up, getting you ready for a highlight, the Thuvian Sun Orchid is really, really smooth when you mix it with the Royal Purple. It gives a really nice clean blend, and you don't really need to do much other than just layer it how you normally would. So I really like to use these two colours together because they just seem to like being applied together. And you can see now that I'm starting to add some Graveyard Bone into that. I'm now having to focus those highlights and be a lot more careful because I've added a white, which is much more solid coverage and won't blend as smoothly. So that's what we end up with once all the purpley parts are in. Now just some final highlights, a good dose of Graveyard Bone added to this, and just some fine edge highlights right off the tip of my brush. You can see I'm really just using the last hair of the brush. There we go, as I'm speeding up, I'm just doing more of the same thing. Okay, so that's where we're at with highlighted purple bits, including that bulge near his hoof. I do also gloss varnish those. I don't think I show it, but I do gloss varnish those as well. Next up is just some more of that Aethermatic blue, but this time it's pure, it's not thinned down. This is the same colour that we use just for putting those green filters into the recesses, and I'm just going to keep building it up aggressively into the eye lenses now. I like contrast paints built up aggressively like this because they dry glossy, so when you're trying to do things like eye lenses, anything that's glassy, a gem, that kind of stuff, they just already end up glossed for you, which helps a little bit with selling the look. And then I realised that I hadn't painted the hair on the light grenade at the back, so I just quickly whipped that in using the exact same black workup, just being a bit more intense towards the greys because I want it more grey than black, but the actual workup itself is exactly the same as the black. Next up we're going to hit some Deathworld Forest, and this is going to be thinned right down to a fine glaze. You'll see on the back of my hand here there's barely any colour to it. And again, this is just a filter. We're going to filter leading into the hair. We're going to filter a couple of areas of the armour as well. This sort of just adds a little kind of putrescent decay kind of tone to things. And it's more of a kind of rule of cool application. I'm just looking for areas where I think it will look sweet. So I decided to just stain the shoulder pads back a little bit and use it to blend into a few areas. It's very, very simple. It's just a fine glaze, just applied evenly over the surface. And then when it's completely dry, you can put an extra layer or two in until it hits the intensity that you want. Now we've got some of that Aethermatic blue mixed in with some of our graveyard bone to make a really pale turquoise, and we're just going to add some highlights to the eye lenses. I'll lighten this again with another spot of the graveyard bone to get an even finer highlight, but this is purely just for these eye lenses. It's not used anywhere else on the miniature. Is done, and a bit of green staining. Now, one of my favourite paints in Reaper MSP's range, Ebony Flesh. It's a really deep red brown, and we're thinning this again to a glaze, and we're going to start using this to I just touch a little bit onto this bulgy bit here because I needed to kind of desaturate it a spot. The actual intention here, what we really want to do with it, the reason we've got it so thin, is because we now want to confirm all of those streaking areas. So we're using an acrylic paint because it will cover a lot harder, a lot more assertively, and using the guidelines that we set down with our oil washes, and this is why we created those guideline areas, we're now going to use some really, really fine brush strokes just to have muck and grime dripping out of areas and running down the armour here and there. This is where it really starts to look pretty gross, pretty decayed, and it's a really cool kind of transformative point on the piece. It's one of my favourite parts of the process. There you go, you can see that's made a massive, massive difference to the look of the piece. Finally, some pure white, and this again is going to be thinned down quite a lot so that it's transparent. And we're just going to take a little tour around the miniature and just look for any areas that we think need a little pop of highlight, just a little bit of bright, pushed highlight, just to make them stand out. And this, you know, it will vary to taste a little. I don't like to push too much of this really, really bright highlight because I think it can start to make things look a bit like, you know, they're under a spotlight. It can make things look a bit unnatural. But you may decide that you want to really edge highlight the hell out of it and, you know, get every single part of it. I decided to be fairly conservative. We just go around the miniature, look for areas where we want a bit of an edge highlight in white, and we add in a little edge highlight in white. We can also use this to put some final highlights onto the leather, onto the hair. So because it's thinned down to the point where it's transparent, it's not going to look too sudden, too jumpy, no matter where we put it. So we get a bit of freedom with this just to tour the miniature and do something kind of cool. So, after all of that effort, this is what it gets you. We've added gloss varnish, as you can see, to the tentacles. The base is just some Martian iron crust from GW, some yellow pigment powder, and a tuft from Army Painter, I believe. But you can see the results here. You know, it's a really nice, grimy, murky looking armour, but that doesn't mean it can't be bright, and there's still some really good contrast to the miniature. We've got really bright brights, we've got some fluorescent coming in with that purple, we've got, you know, those bright greens in the eye gems, but then at the same time we've got these really dingy, dark, crusty, grimy areas, and that gives us such a cool contrast of texture, of colour, of value. It's really interesting to look at, and I think that's why I love this workup just so much. And there we have it, a completed White Death Guard tutorial. I'm so proud of this piece, and I think even including stuff that I've painted not for content, this holds up as one of the coolest miniatures that I've painted for some time. It's one of those that I really do have to encourage you to have a try at. It might look like we're using a lot of different materials, and it might also look like we're using a few alien materials, but the actual processes that we do in that workup, none of them are overly difficult, which means that it's a good opportunity to get to grips with some new materials perhaps, or try some paints that you've never tried before. For the most part, the majority of the colours could be substituted for pretty much anything that you had on hand that was a nearby colour. The only thing I would recommend is that when you come to the rust effects, use Scale 75 or Reaper, because their matteness really mimics the texture of rust, which is something you're not going to get from a satin paint unless you use a specialised paint that is designed for a matte look. So that's going to be all for this week. I thank you so much again for watching another one of my tutorials. I am having a great time making these. I will be back with something else for you very, very soon. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.